I do think things like agentic AI can alleviate some of the stress and the strains in that data wrangling that, quite frankly, every data scientist spends 80 to 90% of their time doing, and they don't want to do that. And actually, I think that applies across the whole business. You look at folks in operations teams, they're spending a lot of time wrangling data when they don't want to be doing that. They want to be forging and building relationships with sites and investigators and understanding patient experience. They're the things that they want to do. And I think that's the opportunity, and I think that's where I'm certainly trying to push and steer, where I can, in my little corner of the industry.
I'm Pedro Coelho, your host, and this is the End Talks. In this episode, from data wrangling to decision making, with my guest, Adam Taylor.
Well, first of all, Adam, thank you for making your way here and coming to the end and join us on this craziness of an event that we're putting together. I mean, I always like to start with who you are and what brought you here. So maybe for those that don't know you, who is Adam Taylor and what brought you to be who you are today?
Oh, wow. So start with a small question then.
Sure.
Okay, so I'm Adam Taylor. I'm currently a clinical data scientist at AstraZeneca. I've worked in pharma for over 22 years now with a background in molecular biology and statistics. I'm here at the end primarily because I met you earlier on in the year and we had lunch and I put cake on my plate and you said, "What are you doing?" And the conversation went from there. But I was quite inspired talking to you about your vision, the company, how it's been growing, and how aligned it was to my view of the industry and where I think we can push it forward. So, thanks for inviting me here.
No, thank you. And again, thank you for coming and for making the effort to be here, even with the CO2 emissions allowance. That is a big point.
Well,
I mean, Adam, looking back, I always believe that something along our lives, if you look back and you put a piece of fabric together, you connect those dots, and it's very obvious how you ended here. But for some reason, those events are really remarkable in our lives. So if I have to ask you from since you were a child, one or two or three, or however many you remember out of the bat, of those points that actually brought you to be who you are today.
All right. I think the first moment when I got interested in science was I was probably 7 and I was bought a chemistry set for Christmas. And I really enjoyed mixing them up, seeing the colors change, watching the bubbles. And then I realized that actually you can make stuff that if you put it on plants, it kills them. And, if you put a cork in it, it's going to explode. And I got really interested in that. I thought, wow, this is me, I'm doing this. And I think that sparked something like, having a wonder for the world and just being interested. And, that kind of never left me, but it changed. I was interested in physics and space and planets and all that cool stuff you are when you're a kid. But I can remember another pivotal moment when I was probably about 14, and I think I'd been playing rugby and I dislocated my finger and pulled it back into place. And I just thought, why didn't it work when it was there, and why does it work now? And it got me thinking, how does my body work? Why do my fingers work? How can I move my arms? Why can I see? And all of these questions coming up about biology, and I really got interested in biology. And when I went to college and I did my A-levels, I did maths and physics and maths and biology and chemistry, and I was just bored of maths, bored of chemistry, and biology was the only thing that actually got me interested. So that's why I went to uni and did molecular biology. So I think they're the key sort of milestones. Two moments of like inspiration where I just thought, wow, this is cool, and one moment of selection through negation, I guess, because the other two subjects were just taught badly.
It's actually funny, by the way, because when you're talking about your story with the chemistry sets,
Yeah.
I actually find it so refreshing how today you're looking back to when you're 7 and you remember it as if it was now.
Yeah.
Playing with those things, because it's how these memories are made. And that's why I always ask this question as a starting point, because I really think that these things make us who we are. And that's a unique piece. You said earlier that one of the things that I guess brought us together was this common vision of I think what we need to do and how we need to do it. I mean, without sharing mine first, but if we start from there, what is, do you think, the future, and how would you want to change this industry?
Well, I mean, over the last couple of years, I've been very focused in the clinical trial recruitment space because if you come to my talk at 4:00 later on, but you know, it's a challenge, and that's a good thing because there's so much clinical research going on. But it does mean that everyone is competing for the same sites, the same patients, and you know, how can we ensure that we get the right patients on the right trials to receive the right medicine such that we can get medicines to patients in the future? And you know, when you think about it like that, you think, oh well, that's a tricky problem. But if I put my statistician's hat on or my data scientist hat on, it's an optimization problem, right? So it's the traveling salesman problem that we all learn about at school. How can you get around these points in the most efficient manner? And you know, I really think we've got the pieces. All the pieces of the puzzle are sitting there. What we can't do at the moment, or what we've struggled to do in the past, is connect them up and connect them in a way that allows us to draw that insight out from it. Now, I know it's very hype at the moment, but you know, I do think things like agentic AI can alleviate some of the stress and the strains in that data wrangling that, quite frankly, every data scientist spends 80 to 90% of their time doing, and they don't want to do that. And actually, I think that applies across the whole business. You look at folks in operations teams, they're spending a lot of time wrangling data when they don't want to be doing that. They want to be forging and building relationships with sites and investigators and understanding patient experience. That, you know, they're the things that they want to do. And I think that's the opportunity. And I think that's where I'm certainly trying to push and steer, you know, where I can, in my little corner of the industry.
It's a very good point. And I think, look, we can first maybe start by deconstructing what is patient recruitment, because I think there's so many parts of it, right? And I think from one hand, you start with probably either. So that's another topic there. I think there's another topic, which is the stratification of those patients, and then ensuring that you have the right type of patients rather than just a patient, which is yet another full topic. And yet again, what I struggled with, by the way, when I started this company, and I didn't have an answer in the beginning and eventually found the answer last year to this topic, was indeed patient recruitment is a problem. And indeed there's small point solutions that will help you being better at patient recruitment, right? So if I stratify my patients correctly, if I may be able to look through a data set in an EHR and select the right patient from there automatically, that will also help me. So there's these little things, right? But ultimately, when you're planning your trial, you don't exactly know how much money you're going to spend, how much budget you have to spend on it, which hospitals have those patients in the first place, where they exist in the first place. But then eventually also how much PIs experience have in those same sites to be able to conduct that type of trial, logistically speaking, and so forth. So what I then struggled with was, how can we make a protocol that is better? Knowing all of these variables, not an aftermath variables, right? Because today still what we do is we make a protocol, then we select site, and then we find patients. But it's not interconnected, right? So we actually go in one chain, a straight line, rather than making it a circle. Because if we could indeed make a protocol, think about which sites, where those patients exist, do they exist or not in those sites, even then go back to the protocol and realize, do we need to make some changes? In theory, we do that with protocol amendments, but we don't do that when we are designing protocols.
But that's a very slow and expensive way of doing it.
So then, which is now taking me to my question, if it isn't circular and it is a linear approach that we're taking today with these protocol amendments, to what extent do you think a lot of the problem starts in the protocol or doesn't start in the protocol and is actually in the execution piece of those protocols?
Well, I think it's both. I think, you know, there's there's countless reasons why you might need to amend a protocol, whether it's a local, regional, regulatory, statistical, operational. There could be a whole ton of issues, and quite often you don't know the outcome until you walk the path, and we learn on that journey by making mistakes. But there's over 500,000 clinical studies being conducted. There are protocols for all of them. There's amendments for them. We know what happened in the studies. The scientific literature is full of the results. So I think there is a corpus of material that we can, if we can extract in a usable fashion, actually ask those questions and challenge some of the assumptions that we make about how we write a protocol or design a study.
The other piece that I guess I used to struggle with or still struggle with, and somehow have to clarify this often with clients is, and maybe obviously bringing my personal experience from Biorce here, once we start working with the client, suddenly you have an AI tool that can do a ton of different things. And sometimes they come back to me and go, by the way, the ROI on ours doesn't seem feasible, doesn't seem to match. That's why do you think that? And they explain it to me. And then I realized at some point, some months ago, one of the problems. The problem was a human wouldn't do the task we ask an AI to do. And it reminded me of back in my early days in my career, when in finance, you'd ask an intern to do something that you wouldn't do yourself. And in other words, what I'm trying to say here is, if I can look to all the trials in the world in cardiology and then make an assumption, I probably would do it, but in the real world, we wouldn't do it. We don't have time to do that. But if I can get an AI to do that for me, I'll definitely will ask him to do that. So to what extent is AI just helping humans doing human tasks better? Or to what extent is AI helping human doing a task that we wouldn't do because we don't have time and resources to accomplish it in the first place? Obviously, I guess it's also a mix of both. But from your perspective, where you think most value add is as?
Well, I think now the word that I think we need to bring up is trust. And I think there is a general lack of trust. And that might be through fear of replacement or fear of errors or, hallucinations. Everyone seems to know what hallucination is in the terms of large language models. So I think we've got to overcome that trust hurdle first. And the trust hurdle is overcome by doing what you've described with your intern. We treat the models as interns. We give them a task to do, we mark it, and if it's correct, it builds trust. Now, I think the piece that is really important is the rationalization that the model provides for making a decision. Because when you add that layer of transparency into the output, that can sometimes either resonate with the adjudicator, or it might challenge the adjudicator, or it might be wrong, right? And the first two are really positive. The second one is a negative, but it could be turned into a positive if we can create some sort of reinforcement framework such that the model adapts and learns. Because that's how humans learn. We make mistakes, people correct us, and then you move forward. So I think short term, it's doing the jobs that we do already, but doing them quicker and hopefully more accurately, but that might take time. And then I think when you reach a threshold of trust, then you can start to do the things that you didn't do before. People are more willing to take that risk, which it is.
It is, and there is definitely a factor piece, I think, that is trust, and that trust, like in humans too, it takes time to build. So I think you will definitely see this. I usually say that this is a generational thing. Yeah. So I think the next generation to come will have a huge trust in language models and AI as a whole, whereas we are still very skeptical to some extent. But you also said something which is actually based on something very similar that I say often to our clients. At the end of the day, what you said, and I quote you now, treat it like an intern. I also say treat it like a human. That's how we learn. Yeah. If someone says anything to you, we don't take that for granted either. Yeah. I'm sure that in your scientific meetings, when you're questioning, do we do this or do we do that? everyone has an opinion. Sometimes they're dispar and in complete disagreement. Other times, I guess some fine tuning needed to again eventually get to some agreement. But in other words, no one is saying still today that an AI should be the source of truth.
Yeah.
And final source of truth, certainly. But then again, like you said too, if we can take it as a step further, faster, to get into something that is a very good piece of work in whatever seconds, then I guess there's definitely something to do there. And without maybe giving any company examples, because we don't want to get into that now, but like, how have you used perhaps AI either in trials or even in personal setting, and that you're like, wow, I'm surprised that this was the end result that we managed to get there?
Yeah, well, so I think the best example that probably changed my view on how well the latest generation of AI tools perform was in terms of summarizing a large volume of slide decks for different opportunities within the company. And what I found myself doing was the manual review. I went through them, started working through them, but the time it was taking me was enormous. I mean, some of these decks were 60, 100 slides long. We're talking thousands of slides in total here. So what I ended up doing was putting them all into my favorite generative AI platform and asked it to create some summaries. And then I got a bit playful. I asked it to create 10 summaries with 10 different personas for different types of people, whether they were statisticians or data scientists or clinical developments, and whether they had different characteristics like positive or negative or, embracing change or, reluctant to change, and got more reports. Then I asked them to summarize those reports and score them. And what I actually found was that where I'd done it manually, the output from the models was very similar. It was very aligned. And actually that gave me enough trust to trust the output of the remaining, PowerPoints that I hadn't reviewed, but to select the ones that were popping up from that for further prioritization. So, that for me was a nice personal demonstration of A, I can save a lot of time if I do this, and B, the answer might not be perfect, but then quite often it's not black or white. It is, shades of gray here. And if it can help me prioritize things, then, I'll settle for that. If I need to review 5 over 15, I'll take that.
There is a taboo topic around AI these days, which is how it will eventually impact the workforce, right? And when I say taboo, it's because I think everyone believes it will have an impact. Many people don't want to perhaps accept that the impact is coming. How do you think in the future, whatever many years you want to put a time frame on it, do you think it will change? How? And, what would be your vision of the workforce in pharma and outside pharma? Because I think it's different too, how it will evolve with this technology.
Well, I think there's 2 timescales. I think there's the advancement of the technology and identification of use cases, which I think works quite quickly because people who are at the bleeding edge of whatever domain they're working in are excited. They want to try things out. But then you've got the rollout into society and more broadly, and that typically takes longer. Not always, but typically takes longer. And then to throw into the mix of that, I'd say, like you mentioned, the generational side of things, right? We've all grown up, it's in the dictionary to Google something about how you find information. But I think what you're seeing is more and more people using AI tools instead to come up to search for information or solutions to their problems. So I think there will be an impact. I think there already is an impact. Just look at your smartphone and all the stuff that can do now, and everyone seems okay with that. I don't know. I'm not a soothsayer. I can't predict the future. I don't know if it will all end as a disaster. I think I'm at heart an optimist, and I think it will only do good, and that's what I will hope for. But I don't know. Who knows what's around the corner? But I don't think it will have the big impact that Hollywood has described for us, I think the benefits will be positive. And I think they'll come through time saving. We'll all end up lazier. Who can remember a phone number now, right?
Oh yeah.
So
The phone number is the least of the problems when you look for.
I know, but
it is a fair point.
growing up, I knew everyone's phone number. And then I slowly lost that ability. So, maybe we'll see changing in skill sets.
I definitely think there is a change in skill sets coming, by the way. I just think, and perhaps worried, I don't want to be the guy of the doom and the end of society, but I am definitely worried on how education will evolve. I think you and I both were taught to read a book, question the book, question everything around you, and eventually make an assumption based on that of what your version of real life should be. And unfortunately, I don't think the next generation tends to be looking more, you have a question, you ask ChatGPT or any AI model, and eventually you get an answer. And then that becomes a source of truth. And I think that will change. It's certainly how human brains have been meant to be built. Because I think education hasn't changed for many, many years. Even though perhaps we are learning with some more online content and less books, the end of the gist was very similar. And I think for the first time now, we're actually having a big shift. And I'm definitely worried. Again, I don't want to be the doom person, but it's definitely a worry that I personally have, which is very ironic considering the job that I have myself. But it's a reality that I think we need to eventually adjust, and hopefully, even though it will be a generational change, it won't be a drastic one.
No, and I think you're right, and I think they're all fair concerns. But the example you gave, read a book and then ask someone about it. You might ask your parents or other family members or your friends. Why is that any different to asking ChatGPT or an LLM? As long as you know that they're infallible. And that changes as you grow up. When you're a kid, you sort of worship your parents. You think they're amazing. As you get older, you sort of, what are they talking about? I know better. But I think as long as you have that mindset that this is an infallible system, then you can question it, and you can question it multiple times, and you can see if there's consistency, or you can see if there's diversity in the answers. But it's going to come down to individuals taking responsibility for themselves. Quite frankly, it's not the fault of the model. It's what you choose to do with that information that's important.
I agree with you, but I'll also say many times my parents will tell me, actually, go look first. And that piece is going to be missing, because no AI model will tell you, I think maybe you should go and find out first. So
unless you configure it, right?
Maybe there will be a kids version.
Kids version, which is, have you looked in the library?
Exactly. Have you tried to?
What's the library?
Unfortunately, I think that's where we're into it. But I do think that there's indeed something there to be done, and I think we tend to build amazing tools, sometimes even unaware of the dangers that those same tools could have to society. But then we also tend to be very good at protecting the society. So I think it's a give and take, I would say, and comes and goes. But maybe one last question to ask you, Adam.
Okay.
If you look forward and backwards at the same time, after many years in this industry and looking at how clinical trials have evolved, this morning I was saying how since 1962, not that much has changed in clinical trials. And it is time that we do change that. And I know you've spent more time in patient recruitment. Where do you expect most change to happen in the industry?
Well, I think there's three areas that I think need to change in order to allow the industry to continue at the pace that it's going, and deliver, medicines back to the patients. The protocols, how we think about the design of our studies. How do we make them smaller, more efficient, reduce the non-response rate? Think about sites. What do we mean by a site? Do we need a clinical site? Could it be done in a GP or a pharmacist? And how do we find new sites? How do we make sure that we know that a new clinical research centre is being developed, invested in, coming up and coming? Or how do we repurpose existing sites to another indication, for example? And then I think patience is the last one. It's finding the right patients. And Paolo mentioned something that I think could change the way we think about clinical studies, is running mechanistic studies rather than disease label studies. So you think about when a lot of these labels were created, we didn't even know about DNA. I'm going to hazard a guess at that one. We definitely didn't know about PCR,
So yeah.
right? So, you know, and since then, you take asthma for an example. I mean, we're still unsure exactly how many subphenotypes there are, but there's probably 4 or 5, and they've got very different mechanistic pathways. And that probably, almost definitely explains why you get a 30-40% response rate when you give these drugs to patients. And as we move into an era of biologics and more personalized medicines, that's going to become more and more important. So thinking about the mechanism rather than the disease label, I think, would be important.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much for
No
doing this.
problem.
Thank you again for coming.
You're welcome. Thanks for inviting me.
It's a pleasure.